If you listened to our most recent podcast, you might have heard some discussion from me about the Nintendo Bump, which is a review score situation about Nintendo games. If you don't know what it is, I'm going to break it down very quickly. The Nintendo Bump is something people discuss for Nintendo's games. So if Nintendo's games get a high review score average on Metacritic, that's considered by some to be an influence of the Nintendo Bump. So the game gets a higher review score simply because it's made by Nintendo. So, if a game does come out and gets a great score and people for some reason are upset about that or disagree with the score, they say, "Oh, that's the Nintendo Bump in the works right there. That you're seeing what the Nintendo Bump does. It's getting a high review score just because of Nintendo." So now that you know what it is, I thought I'd get into a discussion about why I think the whole thing's a little bit silly. So first things first, do I think the Nintendo Bump is real? Yes, I do think the Nintendo Bump is real, just I don't use it in a way that most people seem to. So I think the Nintendo Bump is real as much as I think the Sony and Microsoft Bump is real. I think there are certainly going to be outlets, and I think they're far and few between, that will give a game a higher review score or praise it more simply because it's Nintendo. I think that's going to be the case no matter what industry you're in, no matter what's being covered. Movie reviewers that have an affinity for the Marvel universe, they may not be able to separate their own interest in that universe from doing their review, and it may impact it. And I also think there's reviewers that have an affinity for whatever it may be, and they're able to separate their personal interest and still give a fair and unbiased review. But yeah, I think that bump is there for Nintendo. I do think that some outlets are going to have that, and I think that goes for all games and all consoles, all franchises, no matter what they are. If they're, part of a long-running franchise or an established franchise or an established company that creates game, I certainly think that you're going to get a handful, and I want to stress a small handful of people who will bump up their score because of that. Now, if you're going to agree with me on that point and say, yes, there is a Nintendo Bump, then it would be completely silly to say that there's not a Nintendo Bump in the opposite direction. If there's people who can't bring themselves to openly criticize a game or a company and have to review it well because they feel bad otherwise, then there are certainly people on the other end of the spectrum who are going to lower their score because they don't like Nintendo or they don't like Nintendo's games. You can't have it one way or the other. There's going to be both ends of the spectrum. So at the top and at the bottom, there are going to be people who want to review the game a certain way based on their own preconceived notions, their own biased opinions. So there are indeed outlets or people that are going to poorly review a Nintendo game simply because it is made by Nintendo. So again, these are outliers. These are a handful of people at the top of the review scores and a handful of people at the bottom. And by and large, the people in the middle are the outlets / people that are reviewing games fairly. So, it's a phenomenon that's always going to be there, and it's not something you're ever going to be able to perfectly weed out. And there will be people who will fight to the death saying that they don't do that. They don't negatively review Nintendo games because they're Nintendo, or they don't positively review games by Nintendo just because they're from Nintendo. That's just the way it is. So you have to look at the bigger picture overall and look at, the bulk of review outlets that are going to fairly review games and constantly do that across all platforms and all developers and publishers. And like I said, by and large, I think that is the case. I think the large majority of outlets will honestly approach a game review. And I think those outlets work hard to make sure they weed out the people that are going to cause those issues. And again, they are still there and will always be there, but I don't think it's as huge a phenomenon as people lead on. Now, I'm not saying that review scores in and of themselves are bad. I just happen to have taken myself out of that discussion many years ago. I used to do review scores on Go Nintendo for my reviews of games. But over the years, I came to see it a bit pointless because review scores nowadays are just used as fodder or ammunition for online debates about what game is the best and what platform is the best, and any game under a 9.0 is garbage and stuff. Like, I don't want to be any part of that. All I want to do is offer up my opinion to people, and they can take it as they will. So that's why I stepped out of the review number score situation personally. But for those outlets that are still doing it, they feel it's appropriate. I don't knock them for that at all. With The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild getting such rave review scores and holding the record for the most perfect scores on Metacritic right now as far as video games go, there's been an uptick in the discussion of the Nintendo bump, and there's been various outlets and people saying, look, here's the Nintendo bump in effect. There's no way in hell that Zelda is deserving of those scores, and it's only getting it because it's a Nintendo game. So, you can already guess how I feel about that. I'm going to get into it a little bit, but I also wanted to head over to Metacritic and take a look at the Nintendo bump in action. So let's take a look at some of these overall scores that games from Nintendo have. Again, almost exclusively, when we're talking about the Nintendo bump, it's about games getting a higher review score than they normally would just because they're made by Nintendo. So we're going to look at the review scores here on Metacritic. Mario Sports Superstars has a 65, 1-2 Switch has a 57, Tank Troopers has a 66, Poochie and Yoshi's Woolly World has a 77, Fire Emblem Heroes has a 73, Super Mario Run has a 76, Super Mario Maker for 3DS has a 74, Mario Party Star Rush has a 68, Paper Mario Color Splash has a 76, Metroid Prime Federation Force has a 64, Pokemon Go has a 68, Mario and Sonic at the Rio 2016 Olympic Games has a 65, Star Fox Zero has a 69, and so on and so on. So I'm going to try and not repeat myself here, but I gave you a number of games Nintendo was all directly involved with. Some of them more than others, obviously, but they're still Nintendo first-party games. And the ones I read you were 80 or lower. So I'm not saying an 8, a 7, a 6, a 5. I'm not saying they're bad scores. But, if I'm talking Nintendo bump here, I would imagine that the bump would get you at least mid to high 80s to low 90s, somewhere around there. And you have standouts like 1-2 Switch, which I said was at 57. That's certainly not getting any bump from just being made by Nintendo. If it was, that bump's really not doing anything in the long run. Poochie and Yoshi's Woolly World was at 77. I feel like that's a fantastic game. I feel like there's no real bump there to be argued. A 77 isn't really a score you would say that is getting anything from a bump. And then you look at Metroid Prime Federation Force at a 64. Again, not a title I feel where there's a bump really present. By and large, the list of games I read, I really don't think there's, I guess they're not games you would use to argue that there's a Nintendo bump. So then the question comes in, where is the bump? When does the bump get applied? Who determines the bump? Like, how much is a bump worth? There's so many questions that make it very hard to decipher, where you can find out if this bump is coming in. And I can already hear all the different kinds of complaints about how this isn't being addressed appropriately for the bump, and I'm going to break those down right now. So I'm going to look at Breath of the Wild for this part of the discussion because it's the game that brought up the whole Nintendo bump talk again. Currently on Metacritic, Breath of the Wild on Switch and Wii U sits at 97 overall on Metacritic. So, by and large, those review scores came from people and outlets that put out their reviews the day the embargo broke, if not the moment the embargo broke. So that would mean the majority of outlets had to get together and be like, all right, guys, listen, we're going to make sure this game has the most perfect review scores on Metacritic. We all got to band together and make sure Nintendo gets this bump. So good job by them on the collusion. They really went under the radar to make sure this Nintendo bump went into full effect as soon as the Switch launched. So now, having said that stuff, I could look at the range of review scores and I could have a discussion with someone that believes the Nintendo bump is a real huge issue and a thing that's very widespread. And I could say, all right, why didn't 1-2 Switch get the Nintendo bump? And they'd say, oh, that doesn't count because it's not a well-established franchise for Nintendo. And I'd say, all right, well then why didn't Star Fox Zero get the bump? And they'd say, oh, that doesn't count because Star Fox isn't really one of Nintendo's AAA franchises. And I go, all right, well then why didn't Metroid Prime Federation Force get the bump? And they'd say, oh, that doesn't count because that's a spin-off. And I go, all right, well then why didn't Zelda Spirit Tracks get the bump? And they'd say, oh, that doesn't count. That's an installment on portables. So, where's the silly reasoning stop? And I love the idea that, the Nintendo bump exists, but those people who don't have scruples and will artificially inflate a review score on a game won't do so when there's other qualifiers. They're like, it's a portable, so it doesn't count, I can be honest. Or, oh, it's a spin-off, it doesn't count, I can be honest. Well, when it comes to a mainline entry on a console, they're like, oh, I have to inflate my scores because, I need Nintendo to look good. I just don't need them to look good any other time. I could go further and really confuse things with games like Metroid Other M and Paper Mario Color Splash. The review score averages for those games show that they didn't get the Nintendo bump, and they are main entries in established franchises with AAA characters. Mario and Samus, certainly big names for Nintendo. So why didn't these titles get the Nintendo bump? And when you try and look at it for like silly reasoning like I just gave for the games before, you don't really have anything. All you have is falling back on, why reviewers by and large review games for their gameplay mechanics and different areas like that, how reviewers actually approach games when they give review scores. So if you look at all that, you start to realize that, yes, the Nintendo bump is a thing, but as I said before, it's a bump that goes in both directions, and it's a bump that's not exclusive to Nintendo. It's a bump that goes to every game developer and publisher, because unfortunately, you're going to have outliers on either end that do that kind of stuff, and that's just the industry we're in. But in the middle, the large majority, that's where the truth is. That's where the honest reviewers are. What it all boils down to, I think, is that there are consumers and reviewers alike that will see a game get a review score and they just don't believe it should get that score. And that goes for, good or bad review scores. Some people could look at Breath of the Wild and say, how can this not get a 10 out of 10 from every outlet? Or look at the same game and say, how could it not get 5 out of 10 from most outlets? They've played the game or they just saw the game and they're like, this game is garbage. I don't understand how people don't agree with me. And because, the average out there doesn't fit in with their worldview, they're like, oh my God, I need something to rationalize this. And that's where the bump comes into play, because anytime anybody brings up the review score, I'll be like, hey, do you see Zelda's review scores? It's getting great reviews. And they'll be like, yeah, because of the Nintendo bump. And then they make a snarky laugh and walk away. And they're like, I feel better. I'm okay now. Everything's right in my world. So, hopefully most of you look at reviews and review scores and believe the people behind them to be honest with their opinions and not artificially inflating things. Again, I do believe it's an issue, but I don't believe it's an issue as big as some outlets or people tend to make it. And if you do think it's a big issue, hopefully you have found reviews or outlets where you can read their content and feel it's not tainted by that stuff. So it's all about finding, who you trust and what you believe in, and review styles that mesh with what you feel is appropriate. So that's my feelings on the Nintendo bump. I'd be interested to see what you guys have to say, and I'm eagerly awaiting the comments saying that, of course, I feel this way because I'm biased against Nintendo. So thanks for watching and listening, and I will catch you soon. Hey guys, RMC here from Go Nintendo. If you like what you saw in the video, why don't you give us a thumbs up and maybe even subscribe? We'd love to have you. If you want to see what else we're up to, you can check out GoNintendo.com for 24-hour Nintendo news. You can visit us on Facebook at Facebook.com/GoNintendo. You can check us out on Twitter at Twitter.com/GoNintendoTweet. And we're even over on Instagram at Instagram.com/GoNintendo. I put all the links in the description just to make it easier for you guys to follow. Thanks a lot.